The contemporary Western fantasy landscape is suffering from a severe lack of imagination. Look at modern fantasy releases, and you will find magic almost always universally relegated to one or two uninspired roles. Either it acts as a decorative backdrop to the romance plot in the story, or it is trapped in this very stagnant, decades old loop of rudimentary elemental tropes, wizards, elves, dwarves, fays, all of that. But magic and speculative lore should represent this ultimate uninhabited playground for the world building architecture. It is a space meant for rigorous and radical invention. Yet, Western fantasy remains fiercely, almost stubbornly wedded to this very static, almost idealized version of medieval Europe with this thin veneer of mysticism slapped on top. Almost all fantasy seem to be set in medieval Europe. By contrast, East Asian fantasy, particularly like the Xianxia, Xuanhan Sea dramas, magic acts pretty differently there. There, it's not just this passive background element. It functions as this very logical framework that is used to solve certain problems that would arise in the absence of modern industrial technology. This is a core realization that we must confront. Magic is not merely a cosmetic parlor trick when it comes to a speculative world. It is the replacement for science. Because magic, by its very definition, allows society to bypass the rigid limitations set up by typical science that we know, physics, chemistry, and biology. So, well-designed fantasy world, a well-designed high fantasy world, in particular, should logically be more structurally and technologically sophisticated than our current 21st century world. So the question arises, why is it that our contemporary writers refuse to build such worlds, such advanced fantasy worlds? Why does modern fiction suffer from this collective paralysis of collective anxiety when it comes to engineering this high concept tech fantasy universe where where the entire societal infrastructure operates purely on the internal laws of its magic rather than the laws of science? Today we are going to break exactly this down, this mechanical failure in modern world building in fantasy, by forensically analyzing the narrative design of prominent C dramas today, particularly in the fantasy genre. We are going to see how moving past certain Western standard tropes in fantasy can unlock a very genuinely unique, revolutionary evolution for the fantasy genre overall. So, let's dive straight into the blueprint. To fully dissect this structural stagnation, we must isolate our focus strictly onto a particular type of fantasy, high fantasy. Because in subgenres in fantasy like low or urban fantasy, contemporary fantasy, whatever you want to call it, the narrative architecture relies on our existing modern world where magic is either like hidden under our nose or exists in like a parallel world or just like it's existing in the same space as our own world. So while we can make a strong narrative case that in these worlds and in this type of fantasy, the separate magical world is like technologically more advanced than ours, creating this very jarring, brilliant sort of friction when our protagonist enters this world and realizes that, oh wow, this magical world is like far more advanced than my real world. We can make a case for that. However, we still are tethered to, almost connected to our current reality, our scientific reality. High fantasy, however, sort of frees us from that. In building a high fantasy world completely from scratch, completely from like blank canvas, a writer intentionally sort of strips away the modern technological framework that is built up by science and replaces it entirely with a magic system. Now, this displacement shouldn't result in some sort of primitive world. It grants the author this unique creative freedom to construct this highly immersive, almost alternate civilization that either mirrors our real world or even surpasses real world technology capabilities by utilizing the internal laws of its magic. Consider this fundamental architecture, okay? Across history, human beings have faced universal existential problems like long distance communication, long distance travel. In our reality, we engineered solutions for these hurdles through, the iterative progress, the process of empirical science, and in some cases, just pure luck and discovery. Logically, then, the inhabitants of our high fantasy universe would confront the same exact systemic crisis, but instead of turning to science like we did, they would turn to their own version of science, their magic system. A phenomenal case study, I think, for this would be the mechanical execution that's found in the Xuanhuan epic Guardians of Da Feng. When the protagonist Shu Qian, played by Dylan Wang, acquires this very fragmented jade mirror. It's shaped like literally like those button phones, like a Nokia phone. The narrative introduces this object as something akin to a modern smartphone. Like the moment you see it, you know it's going to act like a smartphone because it literally looks like one. It vibrates when there is like to signal incoming alerts. It transmits real-time audio over a distance and even utilizes a magical equivalent of wireless earbuds to allow hands-free interaction. Isn't that cool? But the narrative design does not merely settle for this, no. It advances the concept further, treating the artifact as this very localized spatial portal. Like our protagonist can literally enter into it. It can make things enter into it, making it this sort of this very huge pocket that allows the hero to carry literally anything they want in this just one tiny thing. This is the pinnacle of logical world building. The mechanics are justified by the world's magic system, by the sect that has that phone. This is what it means to sort of build a technologically advanced fantasy world. It is the realization that when magic is treated as the foundational science, the resulting civilization shouldn't just match our modern capabilities, it should entirely transcend them. To be absolutely clear, there's a stark difference that I want to make it clear here, that I'm not talking about magic that is sort of explained by science. That's a different thing. That would really be constrained by our real world scientific laws and scientific theories. I am talking about a magic system that functions as science within the fabric of the fantasy world. For example, in our reality, we explain the falling of an apple through the law of gravity, that we are stuck to this ground, trees are not trees, like we are stuck to the ground or buildings are stuck to the ground. It's all because of gravity, that the moment the gravity vanishes, we all are gonna just fly away. However, if we imagine like a fantasy world, an equivalent of this would be a world where the objects remain tethered to the ground, anchored to the earth, not by their mass, their weight, or the force of gravity, but by their magical force, where a depletion of the force would mean the object is going to just fly away from the earth. We kind of see these mechanisms of different ways in which modern technology features in these fantasy worlds, using the logic of the fantasy world in certain other epics, particularly in the Xianxia genre, like the legends, or when fate brings the demon, or destiny brings the demon, whatever title you want to call it, and of course the popular love between fairy and devil. In all of these three, there is one particular object, a very similar object. It's always this enchanted mirror or something like that allows you to see somebody in real time, as if you were doing a video call, like that's cool. Like, I would want that, and it should make sense. Now, to a traditionalist, to somebody very much tethered to like a old medieval fantasy type of understanding, they would find this conceptually jarring. It was like, what? No, it feels so weird. It feels out of place. But within the internal logic of a magical universe, it is actually the absence of something like this that should break the immersion. Consider the profound cognitive dissonance forced upon the audience when a fantasy world features this kind of magic who can instantly which can instantly, manipulate elemental forces or heal or, sev- put several flesh back together. Like, it can do things that no one can ever imagine, that our science cannot do it yet. When it comes to something like long distance communication, it fails. Like, you're left to wonder how this magic system that is advanced enough to literally bend the fabric of reality somehow is utterly incompetent at transmitting a basic vocal message across a distance. Like, imagine a world where people can literally look into the future, but they can't communicate long distance. Now, this very structural flaw results in a world that feels very forcefully and artificially contained. The internal logic of the magic is literally allowing you to expand the societal infrastructure, but the author is intentionally sabotaging the process. And one of the biggest reasons for this is just literally a lazy way to engineer plot progression and manufacture conflict using primitive hurdles like lack of communication. We must transcend this, however, because we need to engineer a far more sophisticated catalyst for narrative conflicts. Let's be clear, because, okay, while magic grants the author in sort of omnipotent power to create, we can't also be like, yes, now that you have the ability to create anything from magic, you're going to create a solution for everything using magic. Like, that would not really work. Just like in a real world, science has limitations. Your magic system should also have boundaries, should also have limitations. However, these boundaries, these limitations shouldn't be arbitrary. Like, your magic can resurrect dead people, but it can't transmit a message. Or it can do this, which is really tough, but it can't do this, which is really easy. Instead, the better golden standard for this would be limiting the magic system based on consequence or immediate cost. For example, a healing spell that can heal most of the things, but if you try to use it to probably try and bring a dead person back, or try to heal a person who's about to literally die and that you're not supposed to be bringing them back, and in doing so, the consequence would be that they will lose their memories and their soul will be lost. Or in the case of, let's say, a telepathic magic where a person can read anyone's mind, but there's a catch, like that person needs to touch the person whose mind they have to read, or that reading too many minds back to back can lead to a psychological toll that can cause them to break down. By engineering internal rules that are rooted in some like these high stakes consequences rather than like arbitrary incompetence, we unlock rich character driven conflicts. We move past the tired, frustrating tropes like, well, his warning didn't reach her because somebody intercepted the letter in between, and transition into more profound dilemmas of cost and choice. Like, for example, maybe a magical world where a certain class of magical beings literally power a particular system, a particular technological system of that world, leading to conflict between them wanting a right to live and others literally depending on what they are giving to them. This structural revolution is, I think, vital for the survival of the genre, because the 20th century had its own monumental immersive fantasy architectures, like Lord of the Rings. Maybe it was based on the mindset back then, but our current generation has largely failed to establish a definitely unique modern fantasy mythos of its own, modern fantasy ideas that are driven from our current world needs, not the needs of people like a century ago. If we want to create like a genuinely revolutionary fantasy landscape for the modern era, we cannot keep copy pasting the societal structures of like centuries past. We must look at the technologically sophisticated architecture of our current world, decode its mechanical functions, and rebuild them from scratch using the pure, uninhibited laws of magic. Why then, the question arises, is that Western fantasy industry, is it suffering from this collective sort of paralysis? Why are creators and publishers uniformly sort of afraid to cross the creative threshold? The stagnation, I think, traces back to at least two structural failures. There can be many reasons to it, but I think these two are very prominent. One, the Immersion paradox. The first hurdle is the deeply flawed assumption regarding audience escapism. Traditional narrative theory dictates that fantasy must maintain this rigid distance from our everyday reality to offer true immersion. Like when we think of fantasy, our first imagination is a world that is really different from our world. And I get it, okay? Yes, that's what fantasy is supposed to be. That's what fantasy means, imagination, and imagination usually kind of differs from reality, but we can't forget that our imagination also often is rooted in reality. The moment this sort of speculative world that we have created in our mind introduces elements that literally mirror modern reality, modern technology, modern utility, like a phone, as I said in Guardians of the Fang, or rapid transcend, critics and audiences alike panic, claiming it sort of shatters the magical illusion. But as someone who has seen dramas where you have these kinds of technology, these kinds of things, I'm here to tell you that that's not entirely true. Having forensically, analyzed, as I said, these, dramas that actually, successfully deploy these real world technological parallels, I can tell you with certainty that immersion is not dictated by what we feature in the world and what we not, or how primitive the setting is and isn't. We can literally, have a fantasy world that can operate at an advanced technological baseline and still feel breathtakingly immersive. I mean, of course, a world that is technologically far more advanced than us and can do things that we can't will automatically feel different from our reality, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a world that's like centuries or I don't know how many centuries old, provided the infrastructure is, of course, strictly governed and powered by the internal laws of the magic system. Immersion is not a product of medieval aesthetic. It is a product of rigorous, watertight world building. A masterfully engineered world will captivate an audience through its structural integrity, not just what timeline it is placed in or what aesthetic it has. The second reason for the paralysis has to be the algorithmic safety loop. It has to be the second more insidious barrier that lies in the current state of contemporary authorship. A vast majority of modern commercial sort of writers are actively refusing to experiment for some reason, either because they lack the structural discipline to sort of innovate, or because they're paralyzed by the fear of alienating a hyper-commodified readership. We have trained audiences to sort of crave the familiar, and in turn, authors write the familiar. Like, we love the familiar, okay? We cannot deny that. This, however, has trapped the industry in sort of a stagnant loop. Now, for example, if you open any commercial fantasy release in the recent times, you're almost always guaranteed to find the exact homogenized derivative fake codes, FAE, fake code, occupying the narrative space. Because one specific book somehow with phase succeeded commercially years ago, and now the entire publishing landscape is hyper-fixated on replicating it. In a market literally dictated by trend chasing and safe bets, genuine creative risk taking is heavily, and actively discouraged. I'm not kidding when I say that I literally saw a book that replaced the Fae, F-A-E, with F-A-Y. It was still Fae. I'm not sure why they had to change E with I. Breaking this cycle sort of requires a two-way structural shift, if I have to say. Audiences must consciously demand higher concepts, intellectually demanding world building to signal that innovation is commercially viable. Simultaneously, authors must claim their creative agency, taking bold narrative risks for the pure sake of artistic evolution, and readers in turn must be willing to accept it, willing to meet that threshold. Only then can we move past the structural constraints of this medieval past fantasy type and step into this true unbounded future of speculative fiction, a fantasy that's different from the fantasy that we are used to. It is time to radically redefine the boundaries of fantasy genre. We must stop sort of exhuming the imagination of people who lived like centuries ago. Their needs, their desires, their fiction, their imagination, their wishes to see this particular kind of magic system must have been really different and defined by the world they lived in. And we should stop literally gluing ourselves to that and creating fantasy that reflects our current world. The genre is literally begging for like a structural revolution, if I'm correct, not just in how we engineered magic systems and execute world building, but in how we deconstruct this very tropes that bind our narratives. Our world needs a completely new story, not a shallow echo of centuries gone. With that, we bring this breakdown to a close. If you like this video, please check out certain other videos on my channel, exploring modern media and all of that. And most importantly, leave a comment below with your thoughts on if you think that fantasy needs a kind of change, a very nice tech fantasy kind of thing, and like what are the other things in fantasy that need to be changed. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep theorizing.